The syringe fell from Sarah Mitchell's trembling hands, clattering across the sterile linoleum floor of St. Mary's Medical Center as she watched in horror. The elderly patient in bed 12 had stopped breathing, and every eye in the intensive care unit was now fixed on her, with accusation burning in their stares. Dr. Harrison's voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "What did you give him?" But Sarah knew with absolute certainty that she hadn't given Mr. Peterson anything at all. She had been checking his vitals when he suddenly went into cardiac arrest, yet somehow the empty morphine syringe had appeared in her hand, and now everyone believed she had overdosed him. The beeping monitors filled the silence with their urgent warnings, while Sarah's heart pounded against her ribs, her mouth dry with terror as she realized her entire career was about to be destroyed by something she never did. The morning had started like any other for Sarah, a 26-year-old nurse who had been working at St. Mary's for 3 years. Her worn sneakers squeaked softly against the polished floors as she hurried through her rounds, her faded scrubs telling the story of someone who couldn't afford new ones, but took immense pride in keeping them spotlessly clean. The fabric was thin from countless washings, and there were tiny mended tears that she had carefully sewn with the same precision she used when caring for patients. The other nurses often whispered about her second-hand uniforms and the lunch she packed in a brown paper bag every day, their designer scrubs and expensive salads from the hospital cafeteria serving as silent reminders of the economic gulf that separated Sarah from her colleagues. But Sarah held her head high, knowing that her gentle touch and genuine care for patients spoke louder than any designer scrubs ever could. If you're enjoying this story of courage and redemption, make sure to subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss these incredible true-to-life tales that show how ordinary people can overcome extraordinary challenges. Sarah had grown up in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment above her grandmother's bakery in downtown Detroit, where the smell of fresh bread couldn't quite mask the worry lines that deepened on her grandmother's weathered face with each unpaid bill. The bakery had been struggling for years, competing with chain stores and facing rising rent costs that seemed to climb faster than their modest income. Sarah's childhood was filled with the sound of her grandmother's arthritic hands kneading dough at 4 a.m, the gentle humming of old hymns that helped pass the long hours, and the quiet conversations about which bills could be delayed another month. Her grandmother, Elena Rodriguez, had immigrated from Mexico as a young woman with nothing but a family recipe for pan dulce and an unshakable belief that hard work would eventually lead to a better life. She had raised Sarah after her daughter died in a car accident when Sarah was only 5, pouring all her dreams and determination into ensuring that her granddaughter would have opportunities she never had. "Mija," she would say while teaching Sarah to measure flour with precision, "education is the only thing they can never take away from you. Promise me you'll study hard and become something more than this." When her grandmother passed away during Sarah's final year of nursing school, Sarah had to work double shifts at a 24-hour diner called Mel's Place just to keep herself afloat while finishing her degree. The diner was located in one of Detroit's roughest neighborhoods, where the fluorescent lights flickered constantly and the coffee was always too strong and too old. Sarah would rush from her clinical rotations at the hospital to the diner, trading her nursing student scrubs for a grease-stained uniform and a name tag that read, "Sarah, your server tonight." Every dollar earned was a victory. Every meal skipped was an investment in her future. And every night she fell asleep studying medical textbooks that she had bought used and highlighted until the pages were more yellow than white. Her textbooks were held together with duct tape, and she had memorized every diagram, every medication interaction, every symptom and treatment protocol, because she couldn't afford to fail a single exam. The other nursing students had new books, expensive study guides, and the luxury of focusing only on their studies, but Sarah had learned to absorb information while balancing plates on her arms and memorizing drug dosages while refilling coffee cups for truckers and night shift workers. The apartment she rented after graduation was a studio in a building where the heat worked sporadically and the elevator had been broken for 2 years. But it was hers, and every morning when she woke up and put on her scrubs, she felt like she was honoring her grandmother's memory and fulfilling a promise that had been forged in flour and determination. The walls were bare except for her nursing degree, which hung in a frame she had found at a thrift store, and a faded photograph of her grandmother smiling behind the bakery counter on opening day 30 years earlier. The other staff at St. Mary's came from different worlds entirely, worlds where money was never a constant source of anxiety, and career choices were based on passion rather than survival. Dr. Victoria Harrison had graduated from Harvard Medical School and never let anyone forget it, her designer heels clicking authoritatively down the corridors as she made her rounds with an air of superiority that made the nurses feel invisible. Her white coat was always pristine, her hair perfectly styled even after 16-hour shifts, and she wore a watch that cost more than Sarah made in 6 months. Dr. Michael Chen drove a gleaming BMW to work and often talked about his family's summer home in the Hamptons, regaling anyone who would listen with stories about sailing regattas and charity galas where the entrance fee was more than most people's monthly rent. His medical bag was leather and monogrammed, and he had a habit of mentioning his undergraduate years at Yale whenever the conversation allowed. Nurse supervisor Janet Rodriguez, though kinder than the doctors, still lived in a world where healthcare was a business first and compassion was a luxury that the hospital couldn't always afford. Janet had been at St. Mary's for 12 years, working her way up from a floor nurse to supervisor through a combination of clinical competence and political savvy. She knew which doctors to flatter, which administrators to befriend, and how to navigate the complex hierarchies that determined who got the best assignments and who got blamed when things went wrong. Her office was decorated with certificates and awards, and she drove a sensible Honda Accord that she had bought new and maintained meticulously. To Sarah, Janet represented success and stability, someone who had figured out how to thrive in the medical system rather than merely survive it. But Sarah had something that money couldn't buy, an intuitive understanding of human suffering and an uncanny ability to comfort patients in their darkest moments. She would hold the hand of a frightened child getting blood drawn, her voice soft and reassuring as she distracted them with stories about brave knights and magical princesses. She would sing softly to confused elderly patients during night shifts, old lullabies her grandmother had taught her, watching as their agitation melted away and their breathing became calm and steady. Sarah somehow always knew exactly what to say to family members waiting for news about their loved ones, understanding that sometimes silence was more comforting than empty reassurances, and that a gentle touch on the shoulder could communicate more than lengthy explanations about medical procedures. She had a way of making patients feel seen and valued, remembering their names and their stories, asking about their grandchildren and their hobbies, treating them as complete human beings rather than collections of symptoms and insurance numbers. The patients adored her, often asking specifically for the nurse with the kind smile or the one who really listens. Family members would request her by name, and doctors who worked with her noticed that their patients seemed calmer and more cooperative when Sarah was involved in their care. But the medical staff saw her as nothing more than a poor girl who was lucky to have a job, someone whose background and economic status made her inherently less valuable than nurses who came from more privileged circumstances. On this particular Tuesday morning in October, Sarah was assigned to the intensive care unit, a place where every breath mattered and every decision could mean the difference between life and death. The ICU was a maze of high-tech equipment, monitoring devices that beeped and flashed constantly, and the barely controlled chaos of medical professionals fighting against time and mortality. The air was thick with the smell of antiseptic and the underlying tension of people making life and death decisions every few minutes. Mr. Peterson, a 78-year-old retired mechanic, had been admitted 3 days earlier with complications from diabetes that had spiraled out of control. His weathered hands reminded Sarah of her grandfather's, though she had never known him personally, and she had spent extra time with him, listening to stories about the classic cars he used to restore in his garage behind the house where he and his wife had lived for 47 years. He talked about the 1967 Mustang he had rebuilt from the ground up, painting it the exact shade of blue that his wife had loved, and the 1955 Chevy pickup truck that had belonged to his father and had taken him 3 years to restore to running condition. His eyes would light up when he described the feeling of hearing an engine purr to life after months of careful work, the satisfaction of bringing something broken back to beautiful functionality. But mostly, he talked about his wife Margaret, who had passed away 2 years ago after a long battle with cancer. He kept her photograph on his bedside table, a black and white wedding picture from 1965 where they both looked impossibly young and hopeful. She was the best part of everything, he would tell Sarah, his voice soft with memory and loss. 55 years together, and it still wasn't enough time. Sarah was checking Mr. Peterson's blood pressure on that fateful morning when she noticed something unusual. His breathing pattern had changed slightly, becoming more shallow and irregular, and there was a subtle change in his skin color that made her instinctively reach for his wrist to check his pulse. She had learned to trust these small observations, the tiny changes that could signal significant problems before the machines detected them. Her fingers found his pulse point just as his heart monitor began showing irregularities. That's when everything went terribly wrong. Mr. Peterson's heart monitor began beeping erratically, the rhythm becoming chaotic and dangerous, then flatlined completely with the high-pitched alarm that every medical professional dreaded. Sarah spun around to call for help, her training kicking in as she reached for the emergency button. But somehow she found herself holding an empty morphine syringe that she had never picked up, never filled, never used. The weight of the plastic syringe in her hand felt impossibly heavy as she stared at it in confusion and growing horror. She had no memory of touching it, no recollection of drawing medication, no awareness of how it had come to be in her grasp. But there it was, empty and damning, the evidence that everyone would use to destroy her career and her life. Dr. Harrison rushed into the room with 2 other doctors and immediately began shouting orders for emergency resuscitation. "Get the crash cart," she yelled, her voice cutting through the chaos like a surgeon's blade. "Start compressions. Someone get me an IV line, now." The room filled with medical personnel, each person focused on their specific role in the desperate attempt to save Mr. Peterson's life. "What happened here?" Dr. Harrison demanded, her eyes scanning the scene with the cold efficiency of someone trained to assess and assign blame quickly. Her gaze immediately focused on the syringe in Sarah's hand, and her expression shifted from medical concern to prosecutorial judgment. "I was just checking his vitals when he crashed," Sarah stammered, her voice shaking with terror and confusion. I don't understand how this got in my hand. I didn't give him anything." But Dr. Harrison's expression had already hardened into certainty and condemnation. "You overdosed him with morphine," she accused, her voice carrying across the ICU so that every staff member and several patients' families could hear every damning word. "How could you be so careless with medication? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Her tone was sharp with authority and disgust, the voice of someone who had never made a mistake and could not comprehend how others could be so incompetent. Sarah's face flushed with embarrassment and terror as she tried to explain, her words tumbling over each other in her desperation to make someone understand. "I didn't give him any morphine," she protested, her voice shaking with emotion. "I swear on my grandmother's grave, I don't know how this syringe got in my hand. I was only checking his blood pressure. His breathing changed, and I was going to call for help when his heart stopped." But Dr. Harrison was already documenting the incident on her tablet, her fingers flying across the screen as she wrote what would surely be a report that could end Sarah's career and destroy her ability to ever work in healthcare again. The words she typed would follow Sarah for the rest of her professional life, a permanent stain that no amount of explanation or protest could wash away. "Your negligence could have killed this man," Dr. Harrison announced loudly enough for the gathering crowd of medical staff and visitors to hear every accusatory word. "I'm reporting this to administration immediately. This is exactly the kind of medication error that puts our entire accreditation at risk and exposes us to massive liability." The other nurses exchanged glances, some looking sympathetic, but none willing to speak up in Sarah's defense. They had their own jobs to protect, their own families to feed, their own careers to preserve, and challenging Dr. Harrison was a risk none of them could afford to take. The medical hierarchy was clear and unforgiving, and going against a senior physician meant professional suicide for a nurse, especially one without connections or economic security. Sarah stood there, feeling more alone than she ever had in her life, watching as the medical team worked frantically to stabilize Mr. Peterson, while she became the scapegoat for something she knew in her heart she hadn't done. The isolation was complete and devastating, surrounded by people who had worked with her for 3 years, but were now looking at her like she was a dangerous stranger who had somehow infiltrated their sacred space. What would you do if you were unfairly accused in front of everyone you work with? Let us know in the comments below, because what happens next will shock you even more. Within an hour, Sarah found herself sitting in the sterile conference room on the hospital's administrative floor, facing a panel that would determine not just her immediate fate, but the entire trajectory of her future. The room was designed to intimidate, with its long mahogany table, high-backed leather chairs, and walls lined with framed certificates and awards that spoke of institutional authority and unquestionable power. Hospital Administrator Mrs. Patricia Whitman sat at the head of the long table, her silver hair pulled back in a severe bun that emphasized the sharp angles of her face, and her reading glasses perched on the end of her nose as she reviewed the incident report with the methodical precision of someone who had destroyed careers before. Her suit was expensive and perfectly tailored, her jewelry understated but clearly costly, and her expression was that of someone who viewed employees as expendable resources rather than human beings with lives and families. Dr. Harrison sat to her right, still wearing her air of moral superiority like armor, her arms crossed and her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. She had changed from her medical coat into a blazer that looked like it cost more than Sarah's monthly rent, and her posture radiated the confidence of someone who had never been wrong and never been challenged by anyone with the power to make it matter. The hospital's legal counsel, Mr. James Foster, shuffled through papers that would document the end of Sarah's career with the dispassionate efficiency of someone who dealt with human tragedy as a matter of routine business. His expensive suit and gold watch marked him as someone who lived in a world where justice was a commodity that could be bought and sold, where the poor were automatically guilty and the wealthy were automatically innocent. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Whitman began, her voice cold and professional, carrying the authority of someone who had never known poverty or desperation. "This is a very serious matter that threatens the reputation and accreditation of this institution. According to Dr. Harrison's report, you administered an unauthorized dose of morphine that caused Mr. Peterson to go into cardiac arrest. Drug errors are among the most serious violations we can have in a medical facility, and they put our accreditation, our reputation, and our legal standing at risk." Sarah's hands trembled in her lap as she tried to find her voice, fighting against the fear that threatened to overwhelm her completely. The weight of their stares felt crushing, and she could feel her future slipping away with every word they spoke. "Mrs. Whitman," she managed to say, her voice barely above a whisper, "I swear on my grandmother's memory that I did not give Mr. Peterson any medication. I was only checking his vital signs when he suddenly crashed. I don't understand how that syringe ended up in my hand, but I know with absolute certainty that I didn't inject him with anything." Dr. Harrison leaned forward with a condescending smile that made Sarah's skin crawl with its false sympathy and obvious disdain. "Miss Mitchell, I understand this is stressful, and I'm sure you're frightened, but denial won't help anyone, least of all you. The evidence is clear and indisputable. You were found holding an empty morphine syringe immediately after the patient went into distress. Are you seriously suggesting that someone else administered the medication and then somehow placed the evidence in your hand without you noticing?" The legal counsel cleared his throat and opened a thick folder filled with documents that would seal Sarah's fate with legal finality. "Miss Mitchell, I have to inform you that your employment here is being terminated effective immediately. Additionally, we will be reporting this incident to the State Board of Nursing, which will likely result in the suspension or permanent revocation of your nursing license. You're also being placed on the hospital's permanent Do Not Hire list, which will be shared with other medical facilities in the network." Sarah felt the room spinning around her as the words sank in like physical blows to her heart and stomach. 3 years of dedicated service, countless hours of overtime when the hospital was short-staffed, holidays spent caring for patients while their own families celebrated at home, nights when she had stayed late to comfort dying patients who had no one else. All of it was being erased and destroyed because of something she hadn't done. The injustice was so complete and overwhelming that she could barely breathe, her chest tight with panic and despair. Her grandmother's sacrifices, her own years of struggle and study, the patients who had trusted her and found comfort in her care, everything was being swept away by people who had made up their minds before she even had a chance to defend herself. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible as tears began to flow down her cheeks in a steady stream that she couldn't control. "This job means everything to me. These patients need me, and I need them. I worked so hard to become a nurse. I sacrificed everything for this career. Please just investigate what really happened before you destroy my life. I'm begging you to at least consider that there might be another explanation." Mrs. Whitman's expression remained unmoved, carved from stone and completely indifferent to Sarah's obvious anguish and desperation. "Miss Mitchell, we've reviewed the security footage from the hallway, and it shows you entering Mr. Peterson's room alone at 9:47 a.m. No one else went in or out during the time frame when this incident occurred. The evidence is conclusive and speaks for itself." But what none of them knew was that someone else had been watching the entire incident unfold from a vantage point they never would have expected. Someone whose presence in the hospital that day was so unusual and unannounced that no one had even noticed him. Richard Montgomery, the billionaire owner of the Montgomery Healthcare Group that had acquired St. Mary's 6 months earlier, had been conducting one of his rare and completely unannounced visits to see how his newest acquisition was operating in reality rather than in reports. At 62, Richard Montgomery was a man who had built his fortune by paying attention to details that others missed, and by understanding that the human elements of any business were far more important than the financial spreadsheets and corporate presentations that most executives relied on. He had started with a single urgent care clinic in Phoenix 35 years ago and grown it into a network of 47 hospitals and medical facilities across the Southwest through a combination of shrewd business sense and an unwavering commitment to patient care that was rooted in his own family's experience with medical tragedy. Richard's success came not from ruthless business tactics or financial manipulation, but from his uncanny ability to see the human elements that made healthcare work effectively or fail catastrophically. He understood that hospitals were not just businesses, but sacred spaces where people faced their greatest fears and most desperate hopes, and that the quality of care depended entirely on the character and dedication of the people providing it. On this particular morning, Richard had been dressed in simple khakis and a polo shirt, deliberately looking like a family member visiting a patient so he could observe the real dynamics of the hospital without the artificial performance that always accompanied official visits. He carried a small notebook where he jotted down observations about everything from the cleanliness of the bathrooms to the way staff members interacted with patients' families in the waiting rooms. He had been standing near the nurses' station, pretending to read a magazine about heart health, while actually listening to how the staff interacted with each other and with patients' families. What he heard troubled him deeply. Conversations that revealed a culture of fear, blame, and economic pressure that was antithetical to everything healthcare should represent. That's when he had witnessed something that everyone else had missed in the chaos and emotion of Mr. Peterson's emergency. While Sarah was checking the patient's blood pressure, Richard had seen Nurse Janet Rodriguez quickly enter the room from the opposite doorway that connected to the medication storage area, do something near the medication cart that involved opening and closing drawers, and then slip out just as quickly and quietly as she had entered. In the confusion that followed Mr. Peterson's cardiac arrest, no one had noticed Janet's presence except for Richard, whose trained eye for detail and suspicious nature had caught the brief but significant interaction. He had also noticed the way Janet had positioned herself in the hallway afterward, watching the chaos unfold with an expression that seemed more calculating than concerned. More importantly, Richard had also noticed something else that would prove crucial to Sarah's vindication. The security camera that Mrs. Whitman had mentioned as definitive proof had a significant blind spot that hospital security had never addressed. The camera covered the main entrance to the room clearly, but there was a service store that connected to the medication storage area that wasn't visible on the footage that the administration was using to condemn Sarah. Someone could easily enter and exit through that door without being detected by the security system, especially someone who knew the hospital's layout and camera positions as well as a 12-year veteran supervisor would. Richard made a mental note to check the medication storage area's security footage, suspecting that it would tell a very different story than the one being used to destroy an innocent nurse's career. Richard had spent enough time in hospitals to know that medication errors were rarely simple accidents involving single individuals making isolated mistakes. More often, they were the result of systemic failures, communication breakdowns, staffing pressures that forced dangerous shortcuts, or, in some cases, deliberate actions by staff members who were either covering up their own mistakes or had other motivations that had nothing to do with patient care. As he watched Sarah's devastated face during her confrontation with Dr. Harrison, his instincts told him that something wasn't right about the whole situation. The young nurse's genuine shock and confusion seemed authentic. Her protests had the ring of truth, and her obvious love for her patients was evident in the way other staff members and families responded to her presence. Instead of immediately revealing himself and his position as the hospital's owner, Richard decided to do some quiet investigation, using resources and access that none of the hospital staff knew he possessed. He used his security clearance to access the hospital's internal computer systems and began reviewing staffing records, incident reports, employee files, financial records, and security footage from multiple camera angles that the administration hadn't bothered to examine. What he discovered over the next several hours made his blood run cold and his heart ache for both Sarah and for the patients who had been put at risk by what appeared to be a systematic scheme of deception and theft. Janet Rodriguez, the nurse supervisor who had been with the hospital for 12 years and was considered a model employee by the administration, had been experiencing serious financial difficulties that were driving her to desperation. Her husband Michael had been diagnosed with multiple sclerosis 6 months earlier, and their insurance coverage had been woefully inadequate to cover his expensive treatments, physical therapy, and the specialized equipment he needed to maintain any quality of life. Janet had been requesting overtime shifts constantly, taking cash advances against her salary at every opportunity, and had even approached the hospital's credit union for an emergency loan that had been denied due to her already precarious debt-to-income ratio. Her financial records showed missed mortgage payments, defaulted credit cards, and medical bills that were accumulating faster than she could possibly pay them. More troubling and damning, Richard discovered that there had been 3 other medication error incidents in the past 4 months, all occurring during Janet's shifts, and all blamed on newer nurses who were subsequently fired and had their careers destroyed. In each case, the hospital had settled potential malpractice lawsuits quietly, paying out significant sums to avoid publicity and the scrutiny that would come with public trials. Janet had been the supervising nurse who had discovered each incident and had been praised by administration for her quick thinking in preventing worse outcomes and for her diligent reporting of the errors. She had received commendations for her vigilance and had even been given a small bonus for her role in protecting the hospital from liability. The pattern was clear and damning to Richard's experienced eye. Janet was stealing medications to sell on the black market to pay for her husband's medical bills. And when patients had adverse reactions or when inventory discrepancies were noticed by pharmacy staff, she was framing other nurses to cover her tracks and deflect suspicion from herself. Sarah was just the latest victim in a scheme that had already destroyed 3 careers, put countless patients at risk, and corrupted the integrity of the entire medical system. But Richard knew that accusations without concrete proof would be meaningless in a legal proceeding, and that Janet's years of experience and reputation would outweigh his suspicions unless he could find irrefutable evidence of her crimes. He needed to catch her in the act or find physical proof of her scheme that couldn't be explained away or dismissed. Take a moment to hit that like button if you're as shocked as we are by what's really happening behind the scenes in this hospital. That evening, Richard returned to the hospital after visiting hours had ended, using his master key and security codes to access areas that were normally restricted to senior staff. The hospital at night was a different place entirely, with dimmed lights casting long shadows down empty corridors, and the skeleton crew of night shift workers going about their duties with the quiet efficiency of people who were used to working in the shadows. Richard made his way to the staff locker room, his heart pounding with the anticipation of either confirming his suspicions or discovering that he had been wrong about Janet's involvement in the scheme. The lockers were arranged in neat rows, each one bearing a name tag and secured with either a standard combination lock or a key lock that most staff members assumed provided adequate security for their personal belongings. Janet's locker was in the back row, secured with a simple combination lock that Richard was able to open using a technique he had learned during his own working-class youth, when locks were obstacles to be overcome rather than barriers to be respected. Inside the locker, hidden beneath folded uniforms and personal items, he found what he was looking for. A small gym bag that contained 23 vials of morphine, fentanyl, and other controlled substances that had been carefully removed from the hospital's inventory. The vials were organized with meticulous care, each one labeled with dates and quantities that suggested a systematic and ongoing operation rather than a desperate one-time theft. But more damaging still, Richard found a small spiral notebook where Janet had been keeping detailed records of her sales, with dates, quantities, customer initials, and amounts received that corresponded exactly with the times when other nurses had been blamed for medication errors. The notebook was a criminal's roadmap, documenting months of theft and deception with the precision of a business ledger. Each entry told a story of betrayal and desperation, of a trusted employee systematically stealing from the institution that employed her and destroying innocent colleagues to cover her tracks. The final entry was from that morning, written in Janet's careful handwriting. Peterson incident, blamed on Mitchell. Sold 5 vials morphine to DR, $400 received. Next payment due Friday for Mike's treatment. Mitchell terminated, as expected. Investigation closed. Richard's heart ached as he read those words, understanding the desperation of someone watching a loved one suffer while being unable to afford proper medical care. He had seen that desperation drive good people to make terrible choices, had witnessed the way medical bills could destroy families and corrupt the most well-intentioned individuals. But he also knew that Janet's actions had destroyed innocent careers, put patients' lives at risk, and corrupted the trust that was essential to healthcare. Her desperation was understandable, but her methods were unforgivable, and the collateral damage she had caused was something he could never tolerate or excuse. Richard carefully photographed the evidence with his phone, documenting every vial, every page of the notebook, and the way everything was hidden and organized within the locker. He left everything exactly as he had found it, knowing that Janet would need to be caught in a way that would stand up in court and couldn't be dismissed as planted evidence or administrative persecution. The next morning, Richard arrived at the hospital early and requested an emergency meeting with Mrs. Whitman, Dr. Harrison, and the hospital's security chief. He had still not revealed his identity as the hospital's owner, instead introducing himself as a senior representative from the Montgomery Healthcare Group's corporate office who had been conducting a routine operational audit. "I need to inform you that there has been a serious error in yesterday's incident involving Nurse Mitchell and patient Peterson," Richard began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who was used to being listened to and obeyed without question. He placed copies of the evidence he had gathered on the conference table, watching as their faces changed from confusion to shock to horror. "The actual perpetrator of the medication theft and the person responsible for Mr. Peterson's overdose is Nurse Supervisor Janet Rodriguez," he continued, his words falling like bombs in the quiet conference room. "She has been systematically stealing controlled substances from the hospital pharmacy and framing other nurses when patients are harmed or when inventory discrepancies are discovered." Mrs. Whitman's face went pale as she examined the vials and the notebook, her hands shaking slightly as she realized the magnitude of what had been happening under her supervision. Dr. Harrison, for the first time since Richard had observed her, seemed genuinely shocked into silence, her usual arrogance replaced by obvious embarrassment and confusion. The security chief immediately began making calls to review additional footage from cameras throughout the hospital and to locate Janet, who had called in sick that morning with what she claimed was a sudden case of food poisoning, undoubtedly sensing that her scheme was about to be exposed and hoping to buy time to destroy evidence or flee. "This means that Nurse Mitchell was completely innocent of any wrongdoing," Richard continued, his voice gentle but firm. "She was deliberately framed by someone who had been systematically stealing medications and destroying other staff members' careers when it became necessary to deflect suspicion. I believe you'll find that 3 other nurses were wrongly terminated in recent months due to this same pattern of criminal behavior." Dr. Harrison's face flushed with embarrassment and shame as she realized the magnitude of her error and the injustice she had participated in perpetrating. "We need to contact Sarah immediately," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "We need to apologize and restore her position. The damage to her reputation, her career, her life. How do we even begin to make this right?" But Richard wasn't finished revealing the full extent of what he knew and what he had discovered during his investigation. "There's something else you need to know," he said, pausing for effect and watching their faces carefully. "I'm not just a corporate representative conducting an audit. I'm Richard Montgomery, and I own this hospital and the entire healthcare network." The silence in the room was deafening and complete. Mrs. Whitman's mouth fell open in shock. Dr. Harrison's face turned red with mortification and fear, and the security chief looked like he wished he could disappear entirely. They had all been so focused on protecting themselves and finding someone to blame that they had failed to conduct a proper investigation. And now they were facing the judgment of the man who controlled their careers, their hospital's future, and their professional reputations. "Sir," Mrs. Whitman stammered, her voice barely audible, "we had no idea you were here. If we had known that you were observing—" "If you had known I was here, you would have acted differently," Richard interrupted, his voice carrying a note of disappointment that was more devastating than anger would have been. "But that's exactly the problem with the culture of this institution. The way you treat your staff when you think no one important is watching tells me everything I need to know about your true values and priorities." Richard stood and walked to the window, looking out at the parking lot where he could see Sarah's old Honda Civic. She had returned to clean out her locker and turn in her hospital ID, still believing that her career was over and her future was destroyed. The sight of that modest car among the BMWs and Mercedes of the senior staff reminded him of his own humble beginnings and the struggles he had overcome to reach his current position. That young woman down there represents everything that should be right about healthcare, he said, his voice soft with emotion. She's dedicated, compassionate, skilled, and she genuinely cares about her patients as human beings rather than medical cases or sources of revenue. Yet you were all willing to throw her away to protect your own reputations and avoid the inconvenience of conducting a thorough investigation. Dr. Harrison found her voice, though it was much quieter and more humble than her usual commanding tone. "Mr. Montgomery, how can we make this right? Sarah is an exceptional nurse, and we made a terrible, inexcusable mistake. We failed her, we failed our patients, and we failed the principles that should guide everything we do in healthcare." "You're going to start by bringing her back up here and offering her a sincere, public apology," Richard said, his voice firm but not unkind. "Then you're going to restore her position, clear her record completely, and provide her with a formal letter of recommendation that acknowledges her exemplary service and the injustice she suffered. But that's just the beginning of what needs to happen here." Richard turned back to face the group, his expression serious but hopeful. "This incident has shown me that we have systemic problems in how this hospital operates, problems that go far deeper than one corrupt employee or one rushed judgment. We have a culture where people are afraid to speak up, where economic pressures drive employees to desperation, and where the instinct is to find blame rather than find solutions. That ends today." Within an hour, Sarah found herself back in the same conference room where her career had been ended just 24 hours earlier. But this time, the atmosphere was completely different. Instead of the cold formality and predetermined judgment she had faced before, there was an air of nervous contrition and genuine remorse that she couldn't quite understand. Mrs. Whitman's stern demeanor had been replaced by obvious nervousness and shame. Dr. Harrison couldn't meet her eyes and seemed to be struggling with powerful emotions. And there was a distinguished gentleman she didn't recognize sitting at the head of the table with a warm, apologetic smile that seemed genuine and kind. "Miss Mitchell," Mrs. Whitman began, her voice shaking slightly with emotion, "we owe you a profound and heartfelt apology for the terrible injustice you suffered. We have discovered that you were completely innocent of any wrongdoing in yesterday's incident. The actual perpetrator was nurse supervisor Janet Rodriguez, who has been stealing medications and framing other nurses to cover her tracks. We acted hastily and without proper investigation, and we are deeply, deeply sorry for the injustice and humiliation you endured." Sarah's eyes filled with tears of relief, confusion, and overwhelming emotion as the words sank in slowly. After 24 hours of believing her life was over, of facing the destruction of everything she had worked for, the vindication felt almost too good to be true. "I don't understand," she whispered, her voice barely audible in the quiet room. "How did you find out what really happened? No one would listen to me yesterday. Everyone seemed so certain that I was guilty." Richard leaned forward with a gentle expression that immediately put Sarah at ease, his eyes kind and understanding in a way that reminded her of her grandfather, though she had never met him. "Miss Mitchell, my name is Richard Montgomery, and I own this hospital and the entire Montgomery Healthcare Group. I happened to be here yesterday conducting an unannounced visit when the incident occurred, and I witnessed things that others missed in the chaos and emotion of the emergency." Sarah's eyes widened in shock and disbelief. The owner of the hospital had been there during her worst moment? He had seen her humiliation, her tears, her desperate attempts to defend herself against accusations she couldn't prove were false? She felt a new wave of embarrassment washing over her. But Richard's next words surprised her completely and began to heal wounds she didn't even realize she was carrying. Miss Mitchell, in my 35 years in healthcare, from starting as an orderly in a county hospital to building a network of medical facilities across the Southwest, I have learned to recognize exceptional caregivers when I see them. And you are undoubtedly one of the most remarkable nurses I have ever observed. The way you interact with patients, your attention to detail, your genuine compassion and dedication, these are gifts that cannot be taught in nursing school or learned from textbooks. He paused, his expression growing more serious and emotional. The fact that you were so quickly condemned by people who should have known better, people who should have recognized your character and dedication, tells me much more about the failures of this institution's leadership than it does about you as a person or as a healthcare professional. Dr. Harrison finally found the courage to speak, her voice much quieter and more humble than the commanding tone she had used to destroy Sarah's career just one day earlier. Sarah, I owe you a personal and public apology that goes beyond words. I jumped to conclusions without investigating properly. I allowed my own biases and assumptions to cloud my judgment, and my behavior was not only unprofessional but cruel and unjust. I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me and allow me to learn from this terrible mistake. The apologies continued around the table, each person acknowledging their role in the injustice and expressing genuine remorse for their failures. But Sarah found herself looking at Richard Montgomery with growing curiosity rather than anger or resentment. This billionaire hospital owner had taken the time to investigate her case when no one else would listen, had seen something worth defending in a poor nurse that everyone else was willing to discard without a second thought. More than that, there was something in his eyes and his manner that suggested he understood struggle and hardship in a way that surprised her. Despite his obvious wealth and power, he spoke to her as an equal, with respect and genuine warmth that she had rarely experienced from people in positions of authority. "Mr. Montgomery," Sarah said quietly, her voice still shaky from the emotional whiplash of the past 24 hours, "thank you for believing in me when no one else would. I don't understand why you went to so much trouble for someone like me, someone who doesn't have any influence or connections or ability to help your business, but I'll never forget what you've done." Richard's expression grew thoughtful and deeply personal, as if he were making a decision to share something that he rarely discussed with anyone. "Miss Mitchell, may I share something with you that I think will help you understand why your situation mattered so much to me? I wasn't born into wealth or privilege. I grew up in a double-wide trailer in a mobile home park outside Las Vegas, the son of a single mother who worked 3 jobs just to keep us fed and keep the electricity from being turned off." Sarah's breath caught in her throat as she realized that this powerful, successful man understood her world in a way she never would have expected. The expensive suit and confident demeanor had masked a background that was probably even more challenging than her own. "My mother, Maria, worked as a night shift janitor at 2 different office buildings, a weekend cashier at a convenience store, and she cleaned houses for wealthy families during the day when she could get the work. She never complained, never made me feel like our poverty was my fault. But I could see the exhaustion in her eyes and the way she would sit at our tiny kitchen table late at night, trying to figure out which bills she could pay and which ones would have to wait another month. When I was 12 years old, my mother started getting sick. She would come home from her cleaning jobs barely able to stand, her hands swollen and painful from the industrial chemicals she used, her back aching from hours of bending and scrubbing. But she couldn't afford to see a doctor, couldn't afford to miss work, couldn't afford the luxury of taking care of her own health. Sarah felt tears beginning to form in her eyes as she recognized the terrible choice that so many poor people face between seeking medical care and maintaining the income that keeps them alive. I watched my mother suffer for months, getting sicker and weaker, until finally she collapsed at work and was rushed to the emergency room. By then, what should have been a treatable condition had become advanced kidney disease that required dialysis and eventually a transplant that we could never afford. The room had fallen completely silent as everyone listened to Richard's story, understanding for the first time the personal experiences that had shaped his approach to healthcare and his commitment to treating all patients with dignity, regardless of their economic status. I watched healthcare workers treat my mother like she didn't matter because she couldn't pay, like her pain and her fear were somehow less important because she was poor. I saw doctors who barely looked at her chart, nurses who were too busy to answer her questions, and administrators who saw her as a liability rather than a human being deserving of compassion and care. Richard's voice grew stronger and more determined as he continued. That's when I decided that if I ever had the power to change how healthcare works, I would make sure that people like my mother and people like you are treated with the dignity and respect they deserve, regardless of their economic status or social position. When I saw what happened to you yesterday, I saw my mother being dismissed and discarded all over again, and I couldn't let that stand. The weight of Richard's words settled over the room like a blanket, creating a moment of profound understanding and connection that transcended the typical boundaries between employer and employee, between wealthy owner and struggling worker. Miss Mitchell, Richard continued, his voice now warm with genuine affection and respect, I'd like to offer you something that goes far beyond just restoring your position and clearing your record. I'd like to offer you the opportunity to help me change how healthcare works, not just in this hospital, but across our entire network of facilities. Sarah's heart was pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm creating a new position that I've been thinking about for months, Director of Patient Advocacy and Staff Development. Your job would be to ensure that incidents like what happened to you never occur again in any of our facilities, that our staff receives the support and resources they need to avoid the kind of desperation that drove Janet Rodriguez to make such destructive choices, and that our patients receive the compassionate, personalized care that you've always provided naturally." Dr. Harrison and Mrs. Whitman exchanged glances of amazement and perhaps a touch of envy. Richard was not only restoring Sarah's position, he was promoting her to a level of authority and influence that would make her one of the most powerful people in the entire hospital system. The salary would be $95,000 per year to start, with full health benefits, retirement contributions, and a substantial budget to implement programs that support both staff and patients. You'd have the authority to investigate complaints, recommend policy changes, implement new training programs, and work directly with me to improve patient care and staff satisfaction across our entire healthcare network. Sarah's hands flew to her mouth as she gasped in shock and disbelief. $95,000 was more money than she had ever dreamed of earning, more than her grandmother had made in her best years at the bakery, more than she had thought possible for someone with her background and education. It was enough to pay off her student loans within a few years, to get a decent apartment in a safe neighborhood, to stop worrying about every dollar she spent on groceries or gas. But more than the financial security, it was an opportunity to help other nurses, other patients, to prevent the kind of injustice and suffering she had just experienced from happening to anyone else. It was a chance to make a real difference in people's lives, to use her own painful experience as a foundation for creating positive change. "Mr. Montgomery," Sarah said through her tears, her voice shaking with emotion, "I don't know what to say. Yesterday I thought my life was over, that everything I had worked for was destroyed, and today you're offering me opportunities I never imagined possible. But I have to ask, why me? You could hire someone with an MBA from Harvard, someone with years of experience in hospital administration, someone who comes from the same world as the other executives." Richard smiled warmly, his eyes twinkling with the satisfaction of someone who knew he was making exactly the right decision. "Miss Mitchell, you can get an MBA at any business school in the country, but you can't learn compassion, integrity, and the ability to see patients as complete human beings rather than medical cases or insurance numbers. You have something that most healthcare administrators never develop. You understand what it's like to be powerless in a system that can crush people who can't defend themselves." He paused, looking directly into her eyes with an intensity that made her feel seen and valued in a way she had never experienced before. "You've lived the struggles that our patients face every day. You know what it's like to choose between paying for medication and paying rent, to work while sick because you can't afford to miss a day's pay, to feel invisible and unimportant in a world that judges your worth by your bank account. That understanding, combined with your clinical skills and natural compassion, makes you uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between the business side of healthcare and the human side." Over the following months, Sarah threw herself into her new role with the same dedication and passion she had always brought to patient care. But now she had the authority and resources to make changes that affected thousands of people rather than just the patients on her individual shifts. Her first initiative was establishing a peer support program for nurses and other healthcare workers facing personal crises, providing confidential counseling, financial assistance, and flexible scheduling to help staff members navigate difficult situations before they reach the point of desperation that had driven Janet Rodriguez to such destructive choices. She implemented anonymous reporting systems for safety concerns, workplace harassment, and ethical violations, ensuring that staff members could raise important issues without fear of retaliation or career damage. She created patient advocacy protocols that ensured every patient had someone fighting for their best interests, regardless of their ability to pay or their social status. But perhaps most importantly, Sarah never forgot where she came from or the struggles that had shaped her character. She still drove her old Honda Civic to work, though she could now afford a much nicer car. Still packed her lunch in a brown paper bag because it reminded her of her grandmother's lessons about the value of hard work and careful spending. And still spent extra time with patients who reminded her of the lonely, frightened people she had been before her life changed so dramatically. The difference was that now she had the authority to make real changes and the resources to help others in ways she had never been able to before. When she saw a nurse struggling with financial problems, she could connect them with the Employee Assistance Fund that Richard had established. When she observed patients being treated poorly because of their economic status, she could intervene with the full authority of her position and the backing of the hospital owner himself. Janet Rodriguez was arrested and charged with drug trafficking, patient endangerment, fraud, and conspiracy. During her trial, it was revealed that she had stolen over $15,000 worth of medications over 6 months and had been responsible for 4 separate incidents that resulted in patients being seriously harmed. The scheme had generated enough money to pay for her husband's treatments, but at the cost of destroying innocent careers and putting vulnerable patients at risk. The 3 nurses who had been wrongly terminated in the months before Sarah's incident were offered their jobs back with full apologies, back pay to compensate for lost wages, and formal letters clearing their professional records. 2 of them returned to work at St. Mary's, while the third had found a position at another hospital but expressed profound gratitude for the vindication and the restoration of her professional reputation. But Janet's story also became a catalyst for broader changes throughout the Montgomery Healthcare Group. Richard established a hardship fund for employees facing medical emergencies or other financial crises, expanded the health insurance coverage to reduce the out-of-pocket costs that had driven Janet to desperation, and created support systems to help staff members navigate personal challenges before they reached the point where illegal or unethical behavior seemed like the only option. Dr. Harrison, humbled by her role in the injustice and determined to learn from her mistakes, became one of Sarah's strongest supporters and advocates. She publicly acknowledged her errors in judgment, used her experience as a teaching moment for other medical staff about the dangers of rushing to judgment and the importance of thorough investigation before reaching conclusions about guilt or innocence. The transformation was so complete that Dr. Harrison requested to be part of Sarah's training program for medical staff, helping to teach other doctors about unconscious bias, the importance of listening to all perspectives before making decisions, and the need to support rather than condemn colleagues who might be facing difficulties. 6 months later, Sarah stood in the same ICU where her life had nearly been destroyed, but now she was there in a completely different capacity. She was conducting one of her regular patient advocacy rounds, checking to ensure that all patients were receiving compassionate care and that staff members had the resources and support they needed to provide excellent service. Mr. Peterson, who had made a full recovery and had become one of the hospital's most vocal supporters of the changes that had been implemented, was back for a routine follow-up appointment. His experience during the incident had been traumatic, but he had also witnessed the transformation that had followed and had become an advocate for patient rights and healthcare reform. "Nurse Sarah," he said with a warm smile as she entered his room, his weathered hands reaching out to clasp hers with genuine affection. "I heard about everything that happened that day when I was unconscious, about how they tried to blame you for something you didn't do. I can't believe anyone would think you could hurt a patient. You've got the gentlest hands and the kindest heart of anyone in this whole hospital." Sarah squeezed his weathered hands gently, her eyes moist with emotion as she thought about how much had changed since that terrible day. "Mr. Peterson, sometimes the worst things that happen to us lead to the best changes we never saw coming. If that incident hadn't occurred, we never would have discovered the problems we needed to fix, and we never would have been able to help all the other patients and staff members who needed support." Mr. Peterson's eyes twinkled with admiration and genuine affection. "You know, I've been in and out of hospitals for 30 years, ever since my first heart attack, and I've never seen one where the staff cares about patients the way they do now. Whatever you and Mr. Montgomery have done here, it's something special. The nurses actually have time to talk to patients. The doctors listen instead of just rushing through their rounds, and everyone seems happier and more relaxed." That evening, Sarah found herself in Richard's office, which had become a second home to her over the past months. They met regularly to review the quarterly reports on patient satisfaction, staff retention, employee happiness surveys, and the various metrics they used to measure the success of their initiatives. Both patient satisfaction scores and staff retention rates had improved dramatically since the implementation of their new programs. "Sarah," Richard said, looking up from his computer with the satisfied expression of someone who was seeing his vision become reality, "I have some exciting news. The Montgomery Healthcare Group Board of Directors has voted unanimously to expand your patient advocacy program to all 47 of our facilities across the Southwest. They want to promote you to Vice President of Patient Care and Staff Development with a salary of $140,000 and the opportunity to travel to our hospitals in Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and California to implement these changes everywhere." Sarah looked out the window at the parking lot where her Honda Civic sat next to Richard's modest Toyota Camry. Despite his wealth and success, he had chosen to drive something practical and unpretentious. Another reminder that he had never forgotten his humble beginnings or the values that had shaped his character. She thought about how much her life had changed in such a short time, but also about how much she had been able to change the lives of others. The frightened, desperate nurse who had stood in that conference room 6 months ago, facing the destruction of everything she had worked for, had become a powerful advocate for justice and compassion in healthcare. "Richard," she said. They had moved to first names months ago as their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship and mutual respect. "A year ago, I was a poor nurse who everyone overlooked, someone whose voice didn't matter and whose concerns were ignored. Now I'm being offered opportunities I never dreamed of, chances to make a difference on a scale I never imagined possible." She paused, her voice growing emotional as she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. "But you know what the best part of all this is?" "What's that?" Richard asked, though his smile suggested he already knew what her answer would be. "The best part is that I get to make sure that no other nurse ever has to go through what I went through. No other patient has to worry that their care is being compromised by systemic problems that we could prevent. No other family has to watch someone they love suffer because of failures in the healthcare system that we have the power to fix." Richard smiled with genuine warmth and pride, the expression of a mentor watching a protege exceed all expectations. "That's exactly why I knew you were the right person for this job from the very beginning. You never forgot that this is ultimately about people, not profit margins or corporate policies or administrative efficiency. You understand that healthcare is fundamentally about human beings caring for other human beings, and that everything else is just details." As Sarah accepted the promotion and began planning the expansion of their programs to hospitals across the Southwest, she often reflected on how a single moment of injustice had led to opportunities for justice on a much larger scale. Her story had become an inspiration to nurses throughout the hospital network, proof that integrity and compassion could triumph over prejudice, hasty judgment, and systemic failures. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in the culture of the hospitals themselves. Staff members felt empowered to speak up about problems without fear of retaliation. Patients felt heard and respected regardless of their economic status. And the focus had shifted from blame and liability to learning, improvement, and genuine care for both patients and the people who served them. The poor nurse who had once been invisible, whose voice hadn't mattered, and whose concerns had been dismissed, had become the catalyst for transformation that would benefit thousands of people across multiple states. Her pain had become purpose, her struggle had become strength, and her vindication had become a foundation for justice that would protect countless others from similar experiences. What would you do if you found yourself with the power to prevent others from suffering the injustice you experienced? Share your thoughts in the comments below. 3 years later, Sarah stood at the podium of the National Healthcare Workers Convention in Chicago, addressing an audience of over 2,000 healthcare professionals, administrators, patient advocates, and policymakers who had come to learn about the programs that had started with one nurse's refusal to accept injustice and one hospital owner's commitment to doing what was right rather than what was convenient. The convention center was filled to capacity, with additional attendees joining virtually from around the world to hear about the Montgomery Healthcare Group's revolutionary approach to patient advocacy and staff support. Sarah's keynote address, titled "From Victim to Victory: Transforming Healthcare Through Compassion and Accountability," had been highly anticipated throughout the healthcare community. In the audience sat Richard Montgomery, now recognized as a visionary leader in healthcare reform; Dr. Harrison, who had become a national spokesperson for eliminating bias in medical decision-making; Mrs. Whitman, who had completely transformed her approach to hospital administration; and hundreds of healthcare workers from across the country who had implemented similar programs in their own institutions. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sarah began, her voice strong and confident, carrying easily to the back of the vast auditorium. 3 years ago, I was a poor nurse working in Detroit, someone whose voice didn't matter and whose concerns were dismissed by people who should have known better. I was falsely accused of a medication error that could have ended my career and destroyed my ability to care for patients. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word as Sarah shared her story of injustice, vindication, and transformation. I stood in a conference room facing people who had already decided I was guilty, people who were more concerned with protecting their own reputations than with finding the truth. I was told that my career was over, that I would never work in healthcare again, that everything I had sacrificed and worked for was being taken away because of something I hadn't done. Sarah's voice grew stronger and more passionate as she continued. But sometimes the worst day of your life becomes the first day of your real purpose. Sometimes being knocked down is what teaches you how to lift others up. And sometimes all it takes is one person who's willing to see the truth when everyone else is looking the other way." She gestured toward Richard in the audience, and the camera screens throughout the convention center focused on him as he smiled with obvious pride and affection. Richard Montgomery could have walked away from my situation, could have decided that one nurse's problems weren't worth his time or attention. But he chose to investigate, to seek the truth, and to fight for justice, even when it would have been easier to let an injustice stand. The audience began to applaud, but Sarah raised her hand to continue her speech. What we learned from that experience was that healthcare isn't just about treating diseases or managing symptoms or maximizing profits. It's about recognizing the humanity in every person who walks through our doors, whether they're patients seeking care or healthcare workers trying to provide it. Sarah went on to describe the programs they had implemented, the changes in hospital culture they had achieved, and the measurable improvements in both patient satisfaction and staff retention that had resulted from their initiatives. She shared statistics showing reduced turnover, improved patient safety scores, decreased malpractice claims, and increased employee satisfaction across all 47 facilities in the Montgomery Healthcare Group. But more than the numbers, she shared stories Stories of nurses who had been saved from making desperate choices by the employee assistance programs, patients who had received compassionate care that went beyond medical treatment, and families who had found hope and support during their darkest moments. We've proven that it's possible to create healthcare environments where people feel valued, supported, and empowered to do their best work, Sarah concluded, her voice ringing with conviction and hope. We've shown that investing in the well-being of healthcare workers ultimately benefits patients, that treating people with dignity and respect regardless of their economic status isn't just morally right, but also financially sound. The standing ovation that followed was thunderous and sustained, lasting for several minutes as the audience rose to their feet in recognition of what Sarah and Richard had accomplished. But Sarah's eyes found Richard in the crowd, and the look they shared was one of quiet satisfaction and shared purpose. They had kept their promise to that 12-year-old boy, watching his mother suffer in a system that didn't value her humanity, and to that frightened nurse crying in a conference room while her career was being destroyed by people who cared more about convenience than justice. They had proven that in healthcare, as in life, the most important changes often begin with the smallest acts of courage and compassion. As the convention concluded and attendees returned to their own hospitals and healthcare facilities, many carrying plans to implement similar programs in their own institutions, Sarah reflected on the ripple effects that had emerged from that terrible day when she had been falsely accused. The injustice she had suffered had become the catalyst for changes that would benefit countless patients and healthcare workers for generations to come. 6 months later, Sarah received a letter that would become one of her most treasured possessions. It was from a young nurse named Maria Santos, who worked at a hospital in Phoenix that had recently implemented the Montgomery Healthcare Group's patient advocacy programs. "Dear Miss Mitchell," the letter began, "you don't know me, but I wanted to thank you for the courage you showed in transforming healthcare for people like us. Last month, I was falsely accused of a medication error that I didn't commit. 3 years ago, I would have been fired and had my career destroyed, just like what almost happened to you." The letter went on to describe how the anonymous reporting system Sarah had created had allowed other staff members to come forward with information that cleared Maria's name, how the employee assistance program had helped her family navigate a financial crisis, and how the culture of support and investigation rather than blame had protected her from the kind of injustice Sarah had experienced. "Because of the changes you fought for," Maria's letter concluded, "I was able to keep my job, clear my name, and continue caring for patients who need me. But more than that, I feel valued and respected in a way that I never expected in healthcare. You turned your worst experience into something that saved my career and my life. Thank you for refusing to let injustice have the last word." Sarah carefully folded the letter and placed it in the frame next to her nursing degree and the faded photograph of her grandmother. In that moment, she understood that her journey from victim to advocate had been about more than personal vindication or professional success. It had been about creating a legacy of justice and compassion that would continue long after she was gone. The poor nurse who had once been invisible had become a beacon of hope for healthcare workers everywhere, proving that one person's courage to stand up against injustice could transform an entire industry. Her story had become a testament to the power of resilience, the importance of having allies who will fight for truth, and the incredible changes that are possible when we refuse to accept that things have to stay the way they've always been. Sometimes the people who seem to have the least power are actually the ones with the greatest ability to change the world. One patient, one colleague, one act of courage at a time. If this story moved you as much as it moved us, please share it with someone who needs to hear about the power of standing up for what's right. And make sure to stay tuned for our next incredible story of transformation and hope. Sometimes the greatest victories come from the deepest defeats, and sometimes the most powerful change begins with a single person who refuses to give up on justice.